considering everything that we have to consider and feeling everything that can be felt. Alright, I just finished reading the book, The Perks of Being a Wallflower. And it has a lot of similar themes as the Goldfinch. And I was iterating with AI, and it helped me spot some other books about, like, this common trope. Not a common trope, but this trope in specifically, like the gifted kid burnout. Which really stems from a sense of loneliness and a question of worth. Obviously, they would have like ways like, oh, you're intelligent, gifted, or you've had trauma, and that explains your suffering. But I think this is an interesting question. This is kind of the heart of the why people like seeing this trope, and the stories. And I think it does point to this sense of intellectual loneliness. And missing out on a feeling of belonging. And obviously they would have different like lessons or ideals that they would want to share, but I think before we look at the solution, we kind of have to understand the diagnosis of like why this is. And I think it's certainly an interesting question. I mean, fundamentally, we can understand you matter because you feel. But why people feel like they need to use the logical part of their brain to solve these, I guess, issues is a good question. I think, it's more a statement on the times. More than anything else. And it reminds me of how it kind of got to be this way. It kind of like, in my mind, it came from like our capitalist culture, where the idea was you can kind of buy your identity, you know, Nike or what else, I don't know, other fashion things, or even tech, like they want to sell you something so you can belong to a group. You know, going back to biology, I think it kind of relates to the idea of like tribe and having your own tribe. But in your own place in it. This becomes a tricky question though, because like in terms of the whole wide web of things people can do, it's kind of like fragmented from a common core to different nodes. And so, you know, would it having a, I don't know what having a tribe means. Is it like shared understanding, shared worldview? And this kind of goes back to, you know, religion and what purpose it serves. It's kind of like um, a bonding mechanism for shared groups. You know, religion and society have gone hand in hand for a really long time. I mean, I would say almost like the same feelings of like the religion, you know, it's what allows us to create society, you know. This is the pillars, or at least the values, the theories are the pillars. And I'm not saying everyone needs to become religious, but we need to understand the mechanisms of religion so that people can exist again in tribes. Because, you know, considering the splintering off effect, it's just, I don't know. It's kind of weird. These guys want to just exploit it so they can sell it to you. Gain power. These describe the problem, or at least the feeling of the problem. But the romanticization of self-destruction isn't really that good. I mean, I think at some point you have to accept that you're not that different from everyone else, you know? Like, you know, considering a normal distribution of things, you'd probably be somewhere here. You know, honestly, the fact is, if like this is like a societal problem, there's nothing we can do as individuals to fix it. And so, like, you know, telling you, you know, this is how you should act or this is the problem, like, it doesn't really give you any, you know, weight because you don't really have the cure. I mean, you can cope, which I would say helps. And feeling, a sense of belonging kind of helps other create it. I don't know. And then we also have algorithms that reinforce division. I think there's this idea too that there's this person out there who can resonate completely with you, that it's not a you problem, it's a world problem. Like, you have the open channels for communication, and it's their fault for not being able to connect instead of like you opening the channels for communication. What we can see with LLMs is we can find parallel ideas within different domains, which helps collapse this branching tree into a higher dimensional equation that can describe both branches. So I guess instead of like, because I think it is, it's not just like a society thing, like, oh, some people made the wrong choices with social media. I think at a fundamental level, you know, it's a natural exploration of technology that create a branching effect. We'd have like chemistry here and, material science and biology. Like, I mean, before we had some fundamental, sciences, the natural sciences, and things could be explained. But as we keep on branching off, like, because society, is somewhat guided by a search for truth. And so truth was increasing in complexity, and people were branching off, but there was no compression algorithms to help, kind of fit into our own natural biology. Society was moving away from our natural biology. Like, society was evolving, but it evolved in a way that made it harder for humans. And I think now we're kind of seeing, and this is a somewhat hopeful thing, is kind of finding universality among different domains. And so, like, religion is good and all, no hate on religion, but it doesn't really model the world as we need it to. The Ten Commandments are not really, they can't handle the complexity of modern just judicial systems. So we needed a better Bible, but, describing all the nuances, it was hard. So, like, being able to move back to a spot of universality where we can get, back to the Ten Commandments, where we can unify different theories. This is talking about physics and stuff. I was hearing stuff like, I don't even know what it was talking about, but like gas laws for, you know, higher, like big systems and small systems. They were able to unify equations. Um, and that was good. That was cool beans. And I think, you know, mathematics is having its own revolution of universality. I mean, I don't know if this is true. I'm speaking out of my ass. But, you know, mathematics is good at, well, like, modeling the natural world and human language, like storytelling. It's good at modeling, you know, the human dimension of space. And so I think perks of being a wallflower and the goldfinch were like the kind of like red flags, like someone waving, hey, we got a problem here. And I think we got to reach this point where we have to start, you know, developing universal rules for all state spaces of the human world. You know, you hear some interesting story about mathematics, you know, like how some equations existed unsolved, like they were solved, but, you know, it's hard to know that they were even solved. Like people would resolve them just because it's like too niche and too abstract, and AI is helping, you know, discover that. And I think AI will help too. I mean, at some point, I feel like AI was the natural, you know, evolution. We've reached like a point where we just physically could not, as a human, like with our hardware, it was just impossible to understand what was happening in the world. And so we see kind of AI closing that gaps and helping us understand complex human systems throughout history. And if you want a metaphorical adjacent to today, you know, talk about woke and how woke is dead. I think that's a perfectly good explanation of what I'm trying to say. Is like, you know, we had this simple narrative before. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And it's great. You know, this was good for 1800s, even to when I was born in 2000s. But, you know, it was good, but it didn't model the world correctly. This idea of good versus evil, you know, or just a simple hero was just not good. So, you know, kind of woke comes in and it kind of adds nuance to this. It adds descriptors to the model, you know, and it says Christopher Columbus actually committed genocide. And people are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's not how I was taught it, you know? And that kind of creates a sense of loneliness, you know? Where's the. And it's true, but it doesn't, you know, it's hard to memorize that all because that's Christopher Columbus. That's one descriptor. And then we can have another example of British colonization versus, you know, Germany. And I'm not going to specify which period in Germany, but, you know, you can make some assumptions. And, you know, here they actually committed a lot of atrocities, but it was like accidental, you know. I wouldn't know, not maybe accidental is not the right word. Incidental? Maybe naivety? So yeah, you can add nuance and say like, hey, wait a second, these are actually bad guys. But obviously they're not bad guys for simple reasons. These are complex equations, 0.7 plus 1.5. So you take this simple fact that Britain controlled India and you create a complex equation and you treat these two events as dissimilar. And what we need, and woke was great, and or not great, but like it had its problems because people, it wasn't bonding. It created a sense of loneliness and confusion. And so people fight back and they want to return to this simple narrative, but the simple narrative doesn't work because now that we know more, we shouldn't return to something that doesn't model the world. Like, it's not how society kind of functions. It Society, I think, is truth maximizing. Maybe that's my assumption. We can circle back to it later, but we need to find some universality between these two separate events, and I think a good one is well, actually, I don't want to say, well, maybe I should put the work in. Never attribute to malice what can be explained by stupidity. Now, I don't know if this is the best universal truth because obviously it's hard to say how, genocide wasn't really maliceful, but I think, it can go back to the common human principle of in-groups versus out-groups, and how if someone is perceived to be in an out-group, humans can justify terrible things. This idea of tribes, and we see it even today, like with modern politics, conservatives versus or Democrats or liberals. How sometimes people turn a blind eye to rationality to protect emotional identities. And that kind of idea would help make a universal law on what was happening. And actually, this idea was actually given to me by AI. I didn't come up with it, but it just goes to show how it's kind of bridging the gap between these complex models we've developed and bringing them into a more universal function that helps us navigate state space. And when I say state space, I just mean, kind of like the constraints and laws that govern a certain, area, function. I don't know how to say it. It's like, there'd be the state space of chess, and then there'd be the state space of Clue. And what I'm saying is, by using this example of board games, it's like a different set of rules and classes that it's like the details for the function. And, before you could have model A and model B. This is how you should play chess, this is how you should play Clue, but what this leads is to a fracturing like we saw, and what we need is a model C that can describe both state spaces well. So, a universal thing would be for Clue and chess, um, if oh, here we go. It's better to go first. That'd be a universal rule. And that applies to both things. I mean, it doesn't really help you navigate. Maybe it does. Well, yeah, it does inform decision. So yeah, it does. Versus like before, model B would be do this action. Well, it has to be specific. Uh, Put in your own cards and your guesses to deceive. And then chess would be control the center. So we need a model that can describe all those things, be more accurate, and apply universally. And I think AI can help us do that because it can navigate multi-dimensional vector spaces better than our brain can. It has the hardware and capabilities because we've created all these different um, spaces, and it's just kind of hard to do that kind of stuff. So that's just my feeling on where we're heading. I mean, it's kind of a more hopeful outlook than I would have imagined, but it is interesting, the question, and maybe this is something for the future. What happens when you reach maximum universality? I guess it would be the right thing would be the singularity. And it's interesting. It's like things have reached their most complex form yet. And instead of building into more complexity, it's kind of collapsing in on itself and like reaching its own gravity point. And I mean, future considerations is like this idea for stability versus entropy. And maybe it's not hopeful, maybe it's scary, but it is what it is. I mean, these are heavy issues, and there's nothing more to say than it is what it is. But yeah, that's all.